Hi, everybody, and welcome to the InPower Coffee Break to talk about virtual teams. And we've got Mary Brody and I here. I'm Dana Theus, and we do this coffee break chat, sometimes with guests, sometimes without, every Tuesday at 1 o'clock from 1 to 1:30 Eastern. And we turn it into a video and a broadcast, so we hope you follow us on YouTube, on our site, on the podcast. And anytime you'd like to participate, just sign up for reminders and you'll come online and be able to participate in chat, and we can promote you into the video if you want to have a conversation with us. We encourage you to do that because our conversations are almost always better that way. So very quickly, I'm just going to open it up here. And remind you that you can always find out how to sign up for reminders and look at past episodes as well as topics we have coming up at coffeebreak.InPowerCoaching.com. So very quickly, Mary, let's jump into this with a brief introduction of each other and ourselves vis-a-vis why virtual teaming matters. And I will just say, you and I are a virtual team.
Yes.
So we have personal experience with this right here. Maybe we can bring some of that up. But also, I think we've both worked in large organizations which are global, and where we have people from all over the world really joining into the work we're doing, as well as I think that more and more teams, even when you're sitting next to each other, you end up being a little virtual because someone is working at home or is on travel. In other words, there's a lot of different configurations of virtual. It's not all just working with you're the one person in the US and the rest of the team is in China or India or Brazil or Canada or whatever. I think there's a lot of different configurations that are made possible by technology. Yes. And I'll just say that I've been in one form or another working virtually my entire career, which is going on over 25 years, which lets you know that I was like the first person in my office in a technology company to get email in the late 1980s. So that's where I'm coming from. How about you? What's your experience with all this?
I have been working virtually for over 15 years with teams that have been either global or different like co-locational or multi-locational, all of that. Working with people who are working from home or in different offices, like running the whole gamut, and what kind of goes on with that, especially when it comes to communication and relationship building. I think one of the success stories that I have with it is I worked with a colleague. Excuse me. She and I started off not getting along, but we ended up getting along to the point where we were paired, and with our partnership, we're able to almost surf the organization, where we ended up we could answer for each other in meetings and regroup at the end of the day. And we ended up covering more territory, and she was like 1,500 miles away. So
what was it? I'm just curious. What was it about that relationship that made it work? I mean, was the virtual kind of a problem, or was it part of what made it good?
It was, I would say we were virtual and we didn't have a choice on that, right? There was no choice. We had to be virtual. But what I think did it was we realized if we got to know each other pretty well, and I've even talked to her about me using this success story all over the place. And it ended up becoming like you have to know the person beyond just what you work with them and what you do with them at work, right? And it's like when you work with someone in person, you don't realize the coffee, like go and get coffee or go to the water cooler. Those types of conversations make a difference. And being in person, you get to see the person, you get to see what they're like, and that makes a difference. And when you just interact with them on the phone, you're only getting what they tell you, which could be minimal. And so that's where she and I ended up building a relationship that we got to know each other so we could speak for each other in a meeting. Like we could say, I think this will go over pretty well with the other person, so let's just move forward. And then she and I would check in. And it's because we knew each other so well that we could speak to each other. So it was a lot of work to get there.
Yes.
We didn't like each other to start.
That's also interesting. And just on that point, just as an example, something I've noticed. So first of all, in every virtual relationship, each person is different. So for example, I notice when you and I are working together that we almost always have one little conversation about something else going on in our lives, something that happened over the weekend and when we do that, we work much better together than when we don't.
Yes.
I know some other people I have working relationships with where that's not necessary. But what is necessary is to have a conversation about, how do you think what's happened since the last time we talked professionally, right? So it's like, with that, it's like a bookend. It's like what's happened professionally in this working situation since we talked last, to kind of get us both back into the same mindset. So it's just different, and I've noticed that about these different working relationships. And when I pay attention to that and I give that relationship what it needs, it goes great. If I try to talk to them about personal stuff, or you about like, okay, bang, 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 let's go over everything we've done in the last week, it just doesn't have the same rhythm, and that's okay. It can be.
Yeah. Because it does come down to the relationship, that you do have to develop that relationship, and there has to be some, and like even then you're building also off of like, if it's a professional, like talk about your professional like things that happened, like you're still going into like a personal. I think there's always needs to be a personal with virtual, and we sometimes forget that because it's easy to get into work and versus not. And the personal might be different, but there is a personal. Right.
You reminded me of something which I blanked on. I know what it was. I think this goes to something you and I talked about yesterday when we were talking about this discussion, which just connected a dot for me, which I wasn't even conscious of then, which is we were talking about how this reality that people don't read.
Yeah, right.
And I think there's a lot of dimensions to that. Some of it is, technology is just taking us in directions where it's harder to read everything, right?
Right.
There's just so much. But I think what's really going on with that is that, or in a virtual context, let me put it that way, we can't assume in our personal relationships that reading an email, sending person a document or something, has the same information content and what I call high fidelity information and relationship as something that's more personal. And a lot of times we think we send an email, okay, that's just as good as a conversation.
No, doesn't work.
Yeah, right.
Doesn't work. Too much experience with this. It doesn't work.
Right. I mean, it can be useful, right? Because, documents have information and things like that. Right. It's not that documents and reading are irrelevant. It's just that they don't have the same fidelity as voice, video, even text sometimes in an odd way. If you're really kind of tuned in with someone, you can actually have fairly high communication content via text. And it's not about reading. It's about communicating subtext of what's going on.
Yeah. And I think it depends on like what you're trying to communicate to.
Correct.
So I think everything, it kind of like in this one team, because they were all virtual, right? We were trying to figure out what to use where. And I had to come up with rules for people. I know this is going to sound really bizarre, but like when to use the phone, when to use chat, when to use a text message, when to use an email.
When you say rules, you meant your rules for yourself in terms of how to communicate with them?
Well, I gave some guidelines because what ended up happening is that I started to observe like people writing a book on chat, like a tome. And it's like, stop it, send an email. Or someone asking someone wanting an opinion discussion and getting all into it via chat when it's like we should have a phone conversation. Let's just have a phone conversation. Or they end up doing a banter back and forth with email. Oh my God, just flood my email box like every 2 minutes, right? It can be fun, but it's also like, give me a break. Let's just have a damn conversation. So, it's kind of like how to best use, like you said, like with text, depending on the person, depending on the situation, it's great. If, sometimes it has to be phone, sometimes it should be email, but getting like a 4-page email, is that really necessary? Like, I think we were talking yesterday and I was doing like a I'll get like these page or 2-page long emails from people, and I'll just think to myself, oh my God. And sometimes I just respond like, yes, let's talk about this. And that's it. Because it's like, what am I going to do, right? Spend an hour to craft a message?
Some people do. And you know, there are times when in documenting a lot on email and documenting your response can be really useful.
Yes.
For purposes of referring back to. But I think what we're talking about and I know I do this, I think you do this, is when we're in a virtual relationship, working relationship, well, I guess any relationship, but a working virtual relationship, you know, before I want to reach out to anybody, I want to reach out to you, I think, what's the best way for me to do this? And I run through a little, what are the pros and cons of all the different ways I have to contact you and get information to you or ask you a question? You know, sometimes, and when I do that, when I say, what's the best mode, I almost always know the answer, right? It's when I don't know the best mode, I'm like, I'm on text, I'll just send a text. That's when things get messy.
Right. It can get, because there are different ways to communicate, I think, with people, and it does come down to the relationship and how much you know about them or don't know about them, right? And what you need to get done for work and all of that. Like, there's a lot of factors, and I think sometimes it's not, how to communicate the message. It's like you have to take the step back and think about it a little bit.
Well, and we're talking about channels more than anything else right now, you know, like what's the best channel. And the other thing that I find commonly goes wrong is people don't think about what they want the other person to understand. You know, we have a thought. So it's like, okay, I need to get this out to Mary. I need to get this out to everybody else. And it's just kind of like this blurt.
Right.
But it's not clear what we really want the other person to either understand or do as a result of it. Now, when you're standing at the water cooler or you have that interpersonal interaction, the other person can just say, what are you talking about?
Right.
There's like this dynamic that allows that relationship to just deal with whatever it is that isn't being communicated a little more easily. Now, sometimes those people are a problem in person and electronically too. But electronically, it's really bad because you can send that 4-page email, and if you're not clear that what you're asking anyone to do, now people are just like, I'm going to ignore this because I can't tell what he wants me to do or what she wants me to do. And so I think virtual relationships really require us to be much more precise in understanding what is it we want that person to understand and do. Yeah. How can I frame it for them in a way where that's likely to get across? What channel should I use?
Right.
And though that's breaking down the communication process into a lot of pieces, but it's, you know, virtual relationships are requiring us to do that. And some of us find that burdensome. You know, some, like me, I'm a communications geek, you know, I love that, you know, but not everybody does. And I appreciate that. Which is why some people who communicate back with me, what I think of as low fidelity, I'm patient with, because I get that this is not their preferred mode of communication. They probably prefer to talk in person. So for that person, I'll opt to talk to them personally more when I can. And that's part of the art of it, I guess.
That's true.
So I want to share with you one of the lessons that I teach about this and get your response to it, which is in that mode of like knowing what it is we want to talk about. I find that if we require ourselves to verify with the other person what they thought we said or what they thought we communicated, it tells us a lot, both about did they get it and also did we even know what we wanted them to get. So a lot of the times, you know, I'll be communicating and I'll kind of say, does that make sense? What did you get from this? You know, what are you going to do from this? In an effort to see what information really got through, what action are they going to take? And that tells me whether I communicated effectively, regardless of the channel I was using.
Right. Yeah, it's useful. One thing that I've experienced with the people telling you back. I've had some very bad experiences with this.
Like
they'll spew back. I had worked with a colleague in particular who did this. He'd spew back exactly what
you said,
and that's nice. And then he'd go off and do what he wanted anyway, which I have to say was frustrating, to say the least. It was, and then it was like, so how to get through and communicate out what you want. And sometimes I'd noticed too, sometimes people don't listen. So they'd also spew back, they'd pick the highlights. I think if you become skilled at this, at listening as like radio, that's what I used to notice with conference calls. People would listen like it was radio. So they could spew back certain things right then. And then a week later, like, it would be like, what'd you have for lunch 2 weeks ago on Thursday? Like, oh. And you have done the same conversation all over again.
Yeah. And that's going back to the art of it. I've had that experience too. And what I notice is when that works is when they put it in their own words. So asking them what I said is not as helpful as saying, what does this mean to you? What are you going to do? How are you going to deal? How are you going to take this the next step? Or you ask them an open-ended question instead of what did I just say, which sounds patronizing anyway. And it's like, okay, so what's your next step? And that way you can tell, like, did they really connect into what you're talking about or not? And again, some people are what I call low fidelity. They don't articulate that well, which is why sometimes that if you're in a team and you have this conversation regularly, it can be good to talk about the rules, right?
Right.
And I worked with a team once where the leader always took notes, always replied back to everybody, said, this is what I understood everybody's doing. This is where we'll start in our next conversation unless, we have communications. And it was useful. It was a good kind of a milestone at the end of every meeting. And then the beginning of the next meeting, it'd be, okay, this is where we ended. What's happened since then, et cetera. But that took, that was a lot of work for the leader, but it worked. Kept everybody kind of moving in the same direction. And people who went off on their own kind of were flagged early.
Right. It's the, I know with the, like a daily meeting, like daily scrum type meeting, that's always works. I think it works really well because it does keep everyone focused. Like what'd you do yesterday? What'd you do today? Especially virtual, because you don't get to see what other people do, especially related to the project you're working on. So, yeah.
The other thing, we haven't really talked about technology much, but I do find that instant messaging can be really useful for helping people like Slack or, just an IM or something or chat. That it depends on the group, but I've worked with groups where that was huge because not only was it like, hey, I'm about to call Joe. Have you heard anything from them? Before I get on the phone with them, is there anything you heard that I should know? But also it's sort of like, that personal dimension. Hey, my daughter just called. She just got an award in 3rd grade,
Right. I think every group is kind of different. I've used different tools for different groups. And I think it always depends on what do you want to do? How does the group work best? How much they like certain tools or the other tools. Like there's been some groups that have would have to do phone conversations to keep in contact. Other ones, we could do instant message, or we could use a Slack, or we could use other tools. Like I think it all depends on how it all works and how integrated everybody is in the team too. Because I think that's another challenge.
And the other thing I'll notice, and I'll say here, this is a truism of leadership generally, but I see it play out in virtual teams when it comes to the tools they use too. So many leaders don't realize how much influence they have on their teams. And this has actually been scientifically shown that if you ask a leader, how am I influencing these people on my team? They'll say, not very much. And the people on the team are like, oh yeah, like everything that person does, I pay attention to. And the same is true when it comes for tools. If the leader says, this is my preferred tool, and this is how we're going to do it, 2 things happen. One is a lot of people say, okay, fine, it's not my favorite, but I'll do it. Or they rebel. And So you really kind of, as a leader, you kind of have to do both. You have to ask other people what their favorite tool is, but you also have to make a decision, because if you don't, you can't optimize to everybody's preference, at least and not in a larger group. You have to choose some tools and stick with them. And people have to know what tools to go to for, dealing with the leader and dealing with each other. So it's tricky. The leader really has to listen, try to allow other people's preferences to be influential, but at the end of the day, you got to make your decision, and you got to decide, you got to communicate, and then you have to use those tools. If you as a leader are not using those tools, it doesn't matter if everybody else is, your virtual team is not successful.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I guess I've been in more the self-managed teams, the agile teams, where it ended up, we settled out on a tool, and we had to be open, about how does the team work, because there is a bit of fluid dynamics with it. Because I've seen also people say, let's use this tool, and that doesn't work, right?
Yes.
Because the team just doesn't work that way. I don't know how to describe it. It's very fluid, I think, sometimes to select.
Well, just out of curiosity, when you talk about an agile team, how big is the team, and what does that mean to you, the agile team?
So if I'm on, let's say, an agile development team, it can be anywhere from 3 to 20, depending. And it ends up being around, how do the tools enable us to work better together as a team? Because we're all kind of different. Again, it's been different types of teams and how we function and how we work. But, we have the daily scrums, would have everything would be following agile, but it's just how do we use tools to complement what we need to get done. Which can be different because of personalities and dynamics. I've even worked with within the same company, we've used different tools or have different ways of communicating, because that's just the way it rolls.
What I'm wondering is a dynamic I've seen. I don't know, this team didn't call itself agile. I don't know if it was or not actually, but what happened was, and the reason the leader had to step in and assert, we have to use this tool, was because people started using the tools they liked, and it ended up excluding some others who didn't have access to the technology on a regular basis, various things. And all of a sudden it became obvious that there's this little clique developing around a tool.
That can happen, yeah.
And it was hurting the dynamic of the team. These people are over here chatting on IM, but not everybody had IM or that IM, or,
right.
IM and chat wasn't quite as ubiquitous. And so the tools became part of the problem.
Yeah. That's, I think sometimes it goes also to the team, anytime that there's team, how do they see each other? Is it a hierarchical structure, or is it more the flat structure? Because I've tended to work with teams that are more the flat structure. And when you start getting into anytime it gets into hierarchical, no, doesn't. I always notice it never really works, at least in today's work environments. Before it might have, but now.
Well, now when you talk about hierarchy, are you talking about hierarchy, or are you talking about authoritarian leadership styles? Because those are different. You can still have someone kind of in charge of the team, but our authoritarian styles don't work anymore.
Yeah. That would say, yeah.
So they can't be authoritarian, but they do still have to say, well, at the end of the day, I'm still responsible for getting this group of monkeys moving all on the same tree. So I have to be more creative than just ordering people what to do. But at the end of the day, I got to move people along. And
yeah. There's been people, I've seen they do that, but I would say we don't necessarily see them as a more authoritarian figure, right? It's more they're a member of the team. Their responsibility is to get it done, right? But I think it's more and they might in the organization have a more senior title, but we don't treat them that way on the team. Let's put it that way, right? If that makes sense, they're not if they say I want to use this tool, there might be reasons why we're not. So we discuss those reasons, not just everybody goes and just does it because that's what that person does, because I said so type of thing.
Right. Which is kind of back to my original point, which is you've got to take other people's You've got to take other people's preferences and abilities into effect. I've just seen it where the leader doesn't either participate in the tool of choice or doesn't make their own choice and guide the group in choosing a tool, and then doesn't lead it. So the leader will go and say, well, you guys all use this tool. Go use SharePoint. But I'm not going to use SharePoint. I'm going to use the telephone. And then all of a sudden, no one's using SharePoint. And there was like, but there's nothing documented. Well, the leader kind of pointed the finger, but then everybody hated SharePoint.
Right. And that's where, like, I'll see, like, it's got to be everyone has to like what's going on, even in an organization. Or if it's the organization's tool of choice, like we use SharePoint, then it becomes the people who don't want to use SharePoint end up being excluded, but they're self-excluded. I don't know how to describe that one, but they're kind of excluding themselves because they're choosing not to use it. Because I think in some companies there is that, like, we use this as the tool and that's just the way it is and you have to use it. And I think most people are cool with that. I haven't seen too much resistance to that, but if they can choose what they want to use 9 times out of 10.
Yeah. And actually there is a distinction. I think if you have to have a certain tool to save files and, like there's a sort of an official tool, but there can still be kind of an unofficial tool for all the communication.
Right.
Slack or text or IM. One last thing, because we've got to close out here for a minute and we're just getting going. One other thing I want to mention, and this may be part of another coffee break we can have, not just on virtual, but in general, is that as people are co-located less and as there's more contractors involved in teams and things like that, it's becoming important to be clearer about what success looks like. What's the output? What are we trying to do? Right. Because I don't know, in my experience, when you're co-located and you're just kind of hanging around, there's almost like this gestalt, that everybody just knows what success looks like. But if you're not all there all together, you really have to articulate that, be clear. Yes. And as a leadership requirement, that's more work for you as a leader. On the other hand, that's work you should be doing. I mean, that's what
you won't get me started on that one, because that is what success looks like. I think just defining that helps the whole team function better, know their goals, know what their direction is. Even when it's implied, everyone does have their own. It's like that whole like Plato of the ideal whatever, right? The ideal tree or the ideal dog, right? And if you say like, our goal is to have a fluffy dog, and everyone has a different view of what this fluffy dog looks like, right? And it's like, someone brings someone brings a Pomeranian, someone brings a poodle. They're both fluffy dogs. Who's wrong? Well, neither. But I was thinking, like something different, like a Bichon or something like that. Like it's like, right. So how do we define it? And but I think in some ways the leader, when they define it, like they almost save time on the team because everybody's focused and everybody's aligned, and that makes it better.
Yes. And yeah, I totally agree. I think that's actually what a leader's job is aligning people to a common goal. We don't have time for that. We're going to have to wrap it up here, but I suggest we have another conversation about that, and just about the changing workplace and the implications it has for changes in leadership.
Yeah, because it is different, I think, with virtual. And I think with the advent of agile methodologies through development teams and IT teams, I think it's like flattened organizations. Mm-hmm. And it's not in a bad way, because you have a different perspective of leadership. I know someone was saying something to me about like a VP, right? Like, because someone got upset, like, well, you should go argue with this VP, like why you should do this, that, the other thing. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to argue with them. And they were like, well, why are you just letting him do what he wants? And I'm like, well, at the end of the day, his role, right, and his responsibility is to make these numbers. And he feels pretty strongly that this will do it. So we do it, and we make it a high priority. And it was I know it became very different, because then people would say to me, well, that's not really agile. I'm like, no, actually, it kind of is, because he's setting the priorities. He pays our bills, right? And it's a different way of thinking about it. It's not just, and even then, the rebellion, if there's rebellion, it's because what's the business reason? It's a different discussion.
Yeah.
And like, oh, I just don't want to do it because of all this extra work that's involved. That's no longer in the discussion. So I've seen work environments have been changing a lot. So it's more, what's the business change? Like, what's the reason? What's the rationale? Versus,
internal politics.
Yeah. It's like the internal politics are starting to I think, die on the vine.
I don't know if I'd go that far. I'm glad you're seeing it, but my clients, many of them are not. So let's wrap this up and schedule that for another conversation in the future.
All right.
So thank you. This was great. This was a lot of fun, and we were a little all over the map, but I think virtual teams are inherently complex, and I think we hit on a lot of the dimensions of it, the importance of communication, the importance of tools, the importance of knowing what it is that you want to communicate using various tools, and that whole need to stay aligned, all are really important. So thank you very much for joining us for this InPower Coffee Break. Again, you can go to coffeebreak.InPowerCoaching.com to see what's coming up in terms of future conversations, see who our guests are, sign up for reminders, and get the podcast and view all the past shows. So thanks very much, and thanks again, Mary, for hosting us today.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.